What happened to the billions of dollars Marcos stole from the Philippines, and will it ever be recovered? In the 21 years Ferdinand Marcos ran the Philippines, billions went missing, and now his son is the president. In the early hours of February morning in 1986, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos flew into exile. After 21 years as the Philippines president, Marcos had rigged one too many elections. The army had turned against him, and the people had come out on the streets in their thousands. The Marcoses had seen the crisis coming and been able to prepare their escape, so when they landed that morning at the Hickam USAF base in Hawaii, they brought plenty of possessions with them. The official U.S. Customs record runs to 23 pages. In the two C-141 transport planes that carried them, they had packed 23 wooden crates, 12 suitcases and bags, and various boxes, whose content included enough clothes to fill 67 racks, 413 pieces of jewelry, including 70 pairs of jewel-studded cufflinks, an ivory statue of the infant Jesus with a silver mantle and a diamond necklace, 24 gold bricks inscribed, quote, "To my husband on our 24th anniversary," and more than 27 million Philippines pesos in freshly printed notes. The total value was 15 million. This was a fortune by any standard, easily enough to see the couple through the rest of their lives. Yet, the new government of the Philippines knew this was only a very small part of the Marcoses' wealth. The reality they discovered was that Ferdinand Marcos had amassed a fortune up to 650 times greater. According to subsequent estimates by the Philippine Supreme Court, he had accumulated up to $10 billion while in office. Since his official salary had never risen above $13,500 a year, it was blazingly clear this was stolen wealth on the most spectacular scale. Some of his closest allies also stole billions, as their victim was a nation in which 40% of the people survived on less than $2 a day. The Republic of the Philippines decided urgently to try to retrieve its money. Even amid the chaos of the revolution, the very first executive order issued by the new president, Cory Aquino, established the Presidential Commission on Good Government, the PCGG. It was to recover all ill-gotten wealth accumulated by former President Ferdinand Marcos, his immediate family, relatives, subordinates, and close associates, and given the power to sequester any assets believed to be the proceeds of crime. 30 years later, the PCGG is still working. Its 94 lawyers, researchers, and administrators house proudly in a building recovered from the Marcos family. The government gives it an annual budget of $2.2 million. Its staff have traced money through jurisdictions all over the world and fought their way through hundreds of court cases, and yet something has gone terribly wrong. To date, the PCGG has recovered only a fraction of what was stolen by Marcos' network. No one has ever served a prison sentence for their part in the crime. Now, with his task still far from complete, its survival is threatened by a political development that would never have been anticipated by the crowds who swelled the streets in triumph as Marcos fell. The former president's son, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., generally known as Bongbong, is the president of the Philippines. Now he has the power to shut down the PCGG, as political allies of his family have tried to do in the past. The world's biggest thief will have won. Well, now he has won. Last month, I was given unrestricted access to the enormous archive the PCGG has assembled in its years of global detective work. The president handwritten diary, frequently puffed with his self-raised, the notepaper headed "From the Office of the President," with scribbled sums endlessly totting up his cash, minutes of company meeting with his comments scrawled in the margins, contracts, side agreements, records of multiple bank accounts, hundreds of share certificates, private investigator reports, and tens of thousands of pages of court judgments. It needs to be said that this is not about Imelda Marcos and her infamous collection of shoes. Although her shopping habit is real, she bought perfume not by the ounce, but by the gallon. She hoarded old masters. At one point, she tried to buy Tiffany and Co., but in this particular circus, she was only a clown. Her crazy assumptions and consumption deflecting attention from the biggest and the beast that was out of its cage. The Philippines Commission of Good Government archive tells the inside story of the biggest theft in history and of the master criminal who organized it, skillful, arrogant, cruel. It also opens the door into the offshore world revealed by the Panama Papers. Marcos was one of the first to exploit the rat's nest of secret jurisdictions and hidden ownerships then in the early stages of being built beneath the floorboards of public life. But what is most important about Marcos is that he committed his crimes as a politician. His career starts with cynicism that now seems familiar, manipulating electorates using money to buy power and power to make money, but he went one big step further in merging politics and finance, converting the instrument of government into one vast cash machine. A handful of other autocrats were also busy stealing from their people in that era, in Haiti, Nicaragua, but Marcos stole more, and he stole better. Ultimately, he emerges as a laboratory specimen from the early stages of contemporary epidemic, the legal contagion of corruption that has since spread through Africa and South America, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Marcos was model of the politician as a thief. A single document in the middle of archive marks the start of the detective story. In a swarm of depositions, a young civil servant named Chito Roque describes how, on one night Marcos flew into exile, he worked his way through the crowds outside the presidential palace to gates where anxious soldiers were posted. He was with his boss, a senior official in the new government, and they eventually found their way into the inner sanctum, the Marcoses' private living quarters. There, they could see the signs of hasty flight, food still warm on the dining table, empty boxes, paper scattered on the floor, shredding machines stuffed with paper. His boss went home, but Chito wandered into the bedroom of the deposed president, where I saw a filing cabinet and I opened it, the first drawer, and I saw a safe inside, and there were numbers, a combination that was pasted on the door, so I followed the combination and opened the safe. Inside, he found records of bank accounts in Switzerland, Canada, share certificates, and several letters signed by Marcos. Those documents now sit in the office of the PCGG, along with thousands more retrieved from the palace, of 50 or so other properties the Marcoses and their families and allies owned, and from homes and offices in the U.S. As the years have gone by, hundreds of thousands of pages have been added from the other sources, all now sitting neatly ordered in a white two-story building near the center of Manila. Outside, a 6-lane highway is jammed with traffic, bellowing and belching fumes. Inside, all is calm and cool, and notice asks visitors kindly to leave their firearms at reception. In the early years, the PCGG document suggests Marcos was naive in his crime, with sacks of cash from rich backers and help from the CIA. The bright young lawyer won elections to Congress, then the Senate, but he was nothing special, just another Mr. 10%, selling his political influence. After he became president 10% in 1965, his income from kickbacks from government contracts increased, but his guile went no further than stashing $215,000 in a New York bank in his own name. As far as the records show, he and Imelda took their first steps to real secrecy on 20th March 1968 when they used false names to deposit $950,000 in 4 accounts with Credit Suisse. He as William Saunders. He practiced his new signature on the headed paper, she as Jane Ryan. By February 1970, the Swiss accounts were so loaded the couple added an extra layer of concealment, transferring their ownership to foundations registered in Liechtenstein. Then Marcos started to get really clever. On 21st September 1972, he declared martial law. As his diary records, The Nixon administration consented as he shut down Congress, arrested his political opponents, took control of the media and courts, and suspended all civil rights. On the same day, as a PCGG worker pointed out to me with some passion, he took time off to open another Swiss bank account. In his diary, a week later, reflecting on his reforms, Marcos wrote, "The legitimate use of force on chosen targets is the incontestable secret of the reform movement." Over the following 9 years, an estimated of 34,000 trade unionists, students, leaders, writers, and politicians were tortured with electric shocks, heated iron, and other things. Men, women were dumped in public places. 400 others simply disappeared. With the total power over politics, the president closed in on the country's wealth. This was no longer just about kickbacks. Marcos started to steal whole companies using the crude tactics of a gangster. He wanted the nation's electricity company, Meralco, owned by Eugenio Lopez, patriarch of one of the families who had run the country for centuries. He had Lopez's son charged with plotting an assassination on him, which carried a penalty to end his life in prison. The old oligarch handed over his company for $220. It was worth $400 million. To have gunmen is a gangster requirement. To have gunmen in uniform with all the power of the state behind them is a gangster's dream. Yet most Marcos' takeovers involved no violence. Martial law allowed him literally to write his own law. His decrees passed straight on to the statute book. When he wanted to take over the sugar industry, he set up companies and then issued decrees that allowed them to dominate the planting, milling, and international marketing of Philippine sugar, which accounted for 27% of the exports earning. He then created a Philippine exchange company, decreed it should handle all foreign sugar sales, and used its monopoly position to buy from farmers at rock-bottom prices and sell at vast profit. This allowed him to buy Northern Lines, which had the contract to ship the sugar overseas. Finally, he decreed the sugar industry be exempt from minimum wage law, with the result that 500,000 laborers saw their income fall to less than $1 a day, making even more profit. The PCGG archive shows how, in the same way, Marcos used his own companies to take over the three other key areas of agriculture: coconuts, tobacco, and bananas, granting himself government contracts, monopoly deals, and tax exemptions. He levered his way into dominating industries across the whole economy: lodging and paper, meat, oil, insurance, shipping and airlines, beer and cigarettes, textiles, hotels and casinos, newspapers, radio, and TV. Crucially, he saw his crime through a lawyer's eyes. Of course, people would observe that the Marcoses were suddenly very wealthy. They could live with that. What mattered was to ensure that there was no evidence. Repeatedly, he set up his companies so that outwardly they belonged to the people. Marcos deployed dozens of cronies, relatives, golf partners, political allies, anybody who shared his greed. The crony would sign a deed transferring ownership of most of the businesses, usually 60%, but would leave a blank space for the name. Marcos would hold the deed and leave the space blank. There was no evidence that he owned 60%. Marcos stole, then stole more. The Japanese paid repatriations for the Second World War. He skimmed it and put the profit into his Swiss accounts. He stole international aid money, gold from the central bank, loans from international banks, and military aid from the U.S. He decreed that more than 1 million impoverished coconut farmers must pay a levy, supposedly to improve the industry, amounting to $216 million. He had already issued decrees to gift most of the coconut trade to one of his own companies. Now he stole great chunks of the levy fund, all the while taking kickbacks on government contracts. All this theft created logistical problems. How to handle the tidal flow of money. The PCGG archive shows how Marcos set up his own banking system, using cronies to buy private banks and others to control the state banks. These were useful for stealing more money, and loans that would never be repaid, and for assessing foreign currency, although eventually he set up his own specialist bank to trade currency. on the black. Above all, the banks acted like a network of dikes receiving his ocean of income. Bank staff would make a regular, sometimes weekly trips to the palace to pick up checks and bundles of cash, which were then deposited into dozens of accounts. The millions were then channeled into Marcos's expanding reservoir of offshore accounts. He had 69 in Switzerland alone. Then all he and Imelda had to do was turn on the taps anywhere in the world and cash would come pouring out. Cash that had been washed clean of its connection to the crimes. For all its craziness, the ongoing on consumer goods that followed now seems a natural progression. There were multiple houses for the extended family, a 5.5 million yacht, private planes, helicopters, and dozens of Mercedes Benzes. When the youngest daughter was married in June 1983, they built a new runway and hotel, renovated a 200-year-old church, demolished nearby houses, and rebuilt them into traditional style, imported carriages from Austria and horses from Morocco. The men and women who worked at the PCGG are driven by anger. Each day they discover more detail of this crime while its victims sleep on the pavements and in slums around them. They are well aware of what that money could do to the impoverished people of the Philippines. If Marcos stole 10 billion, this would have paid for the entire government budget for his last year in power 3 times over, and so they want not only to retrieve the stolen money, but to restore it. It is not easy. The Marcoses, with their money and their connections, have always been in the lead. Consider the saga, the missing painting. When the PCGG searched the presidential palace after he fled, they found that the walls of the Bath ballrooms displayed 23 pale patches where once there had been masterpieces. With Marcoses had a townhouse on East 65th Street, New York, where Imelda held many parties. Neighbors told investigators that they had seen 2 18-wheel trailers pull up a few days after the couple went into exile. They had been loaded with antiques and paintings and driven away. By the time the house was searched a few weeks later, there were only brass plaques boasting of treasures that had once occupied the walls. The Madonna and the Child by Michelangelo, the Marquesa de Santa Cruz by Goya, a couple of Monet, and, of course, more Passado. Paperwork retrieved from their various homes revealed that Marcoses had bought at least 304 valuable paintings. Almost all were now missing. The Philippine investigators were left with a few dozen inferior work abandoned in some of the Philippines' homes, and one Henry Fantin Latour found wrapped in a blanket under a maid's bed in one of the New York apartments. They got a judge to order galleries and auction houses not to sell anything that might have come from the Marcoses. There was not much else they could do. During the first year, the PCGG received a little help from several former Marcos staff and allies. A financial aide, Rolando Gapud, gave them details of 5 Swiss bank accounts. By Marcos standards, they did not contain very much, only 365 million, and the bank refused to hand it over. All the PCGG could do was to persuade a Swiss court to freeze the accounts. Gapud and others began to disclose the scale of Marcos' ownership of the Philippines economy. In Manila, the government set up an anti-graft court. By the end of 1986, the PCGG was opening cases against Marcos and his network. One of those who came forward was Oscar Carino, former manager of the New York branch of Philippine National Bank. In a sworn statement, he claimed he had created accounts for 2 fictitious companies to conceal the Marcos millions. It emerged that the painting had changed hands with help of some powerful connections. The court heard that some part had been played by Adnan Khashoggi, the notorious Saudi arms dealer. An Australian TV program claimed dozens of Marcos paintings had been flown out of the U.S. on a private plane. 38 others had been shipped from Hawaii. Acting on request from the PCGG, French police raided a Khashoggi apartment and found paperwork confirming that many of the masterpieces were now in his hands. Khashoggi argued that he had made bona fide purchases from a couple of the paintings and 4 Manhattan skyscrapers but the U.S. authorities claimed that the documents he produced to support this had been backdated and formally accused him of obstructing the court of justice. Khashoggi was arrested in Switzerland and then extradited to New York, where he joined Marcos Imelda and a network of others indicted under anti-racketeering law. But Ferdinand Marcos passed away September 1989 before the case came to trial. He was 72 and had been in a hospital in Honolulu for months. Without Marcos, some evidence became inadmissible. There were reports that White House was leaning on the prosecutors to go soft, that there was too much potential embarrassment for the last 5 U.S. presidents. Imelda told the court she was a poor widow who knew nothing about her husband's activities. Khashoggi protested his innocence and was acquitted of any offense. The transcript of the trial runs to thousands of pages. It ended in July 1990 with all the defendants declared not guilty on all counts. The U.S. authorities agreed to take no further legal action if Khashoggi surrendered the paintings and the skyscrapers, but the skyscrapers were finally sold. It turned out they had been mortgaged to the hilt by the Marcoses. The city demanded unpaid property taxes. Though the building's total sale price was $50 million, the Philippines people received only $5 million. Most of the dozens of the paintings Khashoggi is believed to have handed were no longer in possession. The PCGG retrieved just 26 of them. For the investigators, this was a frustrating journey. Aquino government, which had launched the commission in the heat of revolution, rapidly stepped on the brakes. Her supporters say there was no option. Marcos and his crimes owned so much of the economy, to seize their assets would crash the banks. Her critics, meanwhile, argued that her government was always compromised, that Aquinos were one of the wealthiest families in the country. The old oligarchy was back in power. Whatever the motive, the PCGG was ordered to seize nothing, but instead to work through the courts. Over the following few years, it became clear that this had handed the initiative to the Marcoses, who had the money to hire the very best lawyers. Soon, dozens of cases were sidetracked by endless technical argument. Just as Marcos' wealth was too great to seize, so his political influence was too big to beat. 2 weeks after the revolution, a source in New York has shown the PCGG a report revealing that even before he was disposed, his allies in the U.S. intelligence were aware that he had stolen up to $10 billion. But the CIA refused to disclose what they knew. The Japanese government made it clear to Aquino that they were not going to hand over information. An aid package could be in jeopardy if the PCGG pushed too hard. In the UK, Margaret Thatcher government said was not our business. The problem for these governments was that they had turned a blind eye while the companies had waded into the muck alongside Marcos, taking his money without asking where it came from. In some cases, Marcos, in turn, had paid bribes to senior politicians and made illegal contributions to election campaigns, including those of U.S. Presidents Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. When this surfaced in 1986, they said they had not known where the money came from. A PCGG veteran of nearly 30 years has a special frustration with the U.S. He says they have never handed over all the paperwork seized from Marcos when he arrived in Hawaii, and he flicks through the copies he has. See, some pages which are blank, some inventory pages which are blank. We think they were redacted transactions involving U.S. organizations. They were partners in theft. I don't blame the way he feels. The U.S. does steal in many different ways. Seems like Marcos and the U.S. had a great partnership. By the autumn of 1991, Imelda Marcos was feeling sufficiently safe to go back to the Philippines with her 3 adult children. In New York, the PCGG picked up rumors that some of the paintings were still there and being sold by a professional dealer. They hired a firm to private investigate, IGI, to watch the dealer and to establish that he had some of the Marcos collection, including Goya's portrait of the Marquesa de Santa Cruz. Early in 1992, the investigators discovered the dealer had been warned that they were onto him. The next morning, they watched as 5 men and women of the Filipino appearance turned up outside the dealer's apartment in 2 vans, loaded up boxes in large blue suitcases, and drove out to JFK Airport, where all 5 checked in as first-class passengers along with their unusual cargo. With no legal power to intervene, the investigators could only watch as they flew off to Manila. The pattern of impunity was set. In Seattle of December 89, a jury found that the Marcoses were implicated in a plot to take away 2 Filipino lives of youth activists who had been shot there in 1981. The jury ordered them to pay $15 million in compensation to the victims' families. The money has not been paid. In Hawaii in 1995, a court found the regime had abused the human rights of thousands and ordered to pay $2 billion in compensation. Less than 1% of that has been paid. Having returned to Manila in September 93, Imelda was convicted of personally defrauding the state in a land deal while Marcos was still in power. She was sentenced to 18 years in prison but bailed while she lodged an appeal. 5 years later, the Supreme Court threw out the conviction on technical grounds. Soon, the PCGG was running into more problems as Marcos' allies found their way back into power and argued that the failure to retrieve more stolen money proved the commission was pointless and should be closed. Worse, the PCGG was trained by the corruption it was trying to expose. Some officials were caught exploiting empty Marcos properties and pocketing the excessive expenses. Twice the weakened PCGG made compromise agreements with Marcos' family that were so generous the Philippines courts blocked them. By the late 1990s, Imelda had been elected to the Philippines House of Representatives and was emboldened to give proactive interviews in which she declared there is more money the government is not yet aware of, and we own practically everything in the Philippines, she said. Increasingly secure, her confidence got the better of her. In 2007, she gave more interviews and posed for photographs that clearly showed 8 of the missing paintings gleaming on her walls, including Goya's portrait. Another old master hung on the wall of the office of the House of Representatives. The PCGG went to court for an order to recover them, but with Marcos opposing every move, the case took 6 years. When they finally raided Imelda's office and 4 of her homes in October 2014, they again found only pale patches on the walls. The 8 paintings had once hung in Imelda's crying into her handkerchief. Even so, PCGG has dragged some victories out of the swamp. In 2004, they finally retrieved money from 5 Swiss accounts. At an even slower pace, they seized the assets of half-dozen crony companies and recovered most of the coconut levy. They auctioned paintings, jewelry, silver, and dozens of houses. In total, the PCGG has succeeded in retrieving $3.7 billion. That amounts to less than half of the top estimate for what was taken by Marcos alone. In spite of their efforts, they have watched his associates retire to a life of self-indulgence with most of their fortunes intact. They have dozens of cases still bogged down in courts, including 22 that started in 1987 or earlier. The head of the PCGG, Richard Amorao, is a conspicuously decent lawyer, age 41, who spent 5 years as a commissioner before becoming chairman last year. He points out how a single piece of Imelda's jewelry could have paid for 2,000 young Filipinos to go through college. He is not giving up, yet reflects that it has been exhausting and hard to see how they can win. It's like the traffic jams in Manila. You begin to accept that it just is this way. Deep in the vaults of the central bank, he says, there's a large collection of Imelda's jewelry due to be auctioned next month. It includes most of it was seized 30 years ago by U.S. Customs, another stash found in the palace, and a third intercepted at Manila airport as a friend of Imelda's attempted to fly out of the country. Last year, Christie's valued the collection. They identified treasures had previously been missed, including a tiara that with 25 pearls in a diamond frame seized from the Russian Tsar family in 1918. That is how the former president has stolen billions, up to 30 billion, with some estimates saying from this country of the Philippines, in case you ever wondered why they are still a third world country. And the saddest part is they continue to pick their own politician who continue to steal from them. Thank you for watching. God bless.